Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Application Express Office Hours session. My name is Carsten Czarski, and today we will be talking about web source modules and REST Enabled SQL. Please, since this session will be recorded, please keep your video turned off and hold on with questions until the Q&A sessions. As David said, please enter your questions into the chat, and then we will answer these in the Q&A session after we've went through the slides. Before starting with the actual content. As you can see, my name is Carsten Czarski. I'm with Oracle since 2001. That's 17 years now, which some people consider a dinosaur. And most of that time, the first 15 years, I spent in the German pre-sales organization working with customers and partners on all sorts of application development topics with the Oracle database. In 2016, I then joined the Apex team, and since then my focus is on REST services and Application Express, web source modules, REST Enabled SQL, or short, the stuff I'm talking about today, but also data loading and calendar and some other minor things. I'm on Twitter, and sometimes I'm tweeting about what I'm thinking about. And if you want to get in touch with me, just follow me on Twitter, contact me on Twitter, drop me an email, however you like and whatever is most convenient. I will be talking about 18.1 mainly today. So everything or most of the topics I'm talking about are available, and you can try them out right now. On one or the other place, I will be talking about upcoming directions, and as always, you have pretty sure seen that kind of slide already. So whenever this is future directions, whenever the real future looks a bit different, this is about safe harbor. Don't make any purchasing directions based on these slides and this content. Talking about future, for those who haven't seen that before, I would just like to highlight the statement of direction. So that outlines what to be expected from the very next Apex release. So already on the screenshot, you can see that the next Apex release will be Apex 18.2. And if you're a bit familiar with the new Oracle versioning scheme, that also means it will be in the calendar year 2018. Otherwise, it would be a 19 release. And if you can't remember that URL on the slide, just Google for Apex SOD and Oracle, and the SOD should be the very first hit. So then in a quiet minute, you can read this yourself. Okay, let's now start with today's topics. And the title said REST Enabled SQL, RESTful services, but the more generic topic for this is declarative external data sources. So what does that actually mean? It means that for the first time since Apex had been released, you are now able to access data with your Application Express application, which is not a table or a SQL query in your local database. Because that's what we are used to. Since the very first release of Apex, HTMLDB, back in 2004, the source, the data source of every Apex component, whether it was a report, a form, a chart, or whatever, it always was a table view or SQL query. It always was the local database. And the IT landscape changed a lot during the last 17 years. And what everybody learned is that data today comes from various data sources. It is not only the Oracle database, the local Oracle database anymore. We can even not only count on database links, so we can even not assume an Oracle-only infrastructure to be in place. No, data comes from everywhere, from heterogeneous APIs, heterogeneous systems, and sometimes we don't even know what actual system stores the data. We just get an API. So that was one of the main design goals for Apex 18.1, to enable Apex to deal with external data sources. And before jumping into RESTful services, I would like to give you an impression on that. So whenever you go into Page Designer, for any application page, then drag a region on your page and look at the source part. So these location, and those of you who already played with Apex 18.1 for sure have seen this. There is a new location attribute which says local, remote database, or web source. Then when we pick a local or remote data source, we can choose between a type, table view, SQL query, or the SQL function body. When we pick a web source, we can choose a module. We will get to that later on. And that external data source is available not only for the classic report, but also for interactive report, for charts, for calendars, for the toggle column report, for the reflow report region. So for all read-only, so to say, for all read-only components in Apex 18.1, this external data sources or this capability to pick external data source is available. It's not available for components which do read-write your data. So it's not available so far for interactive grid. It's not available for a classic form. That's something we are currently working on, and that's planned for after 18.2. So it will not be part of 18.2, which I talked about, which I showed the statement of direction for. It will be available after 18.2. Okay, so the most interesting part, of course, is to integrate an external RESTful service. So when we are talking about that we can now pick an external data source for our report, what we want to do is to create an Apex component on top of an external API, right? And in the year 2018, today, external API means most typically a RESTful service. And in order to enable Apex to consume REST data from a report, Apex needs to know something about the RESTful service. Apex needs to have metadata on the RESTful service. It needs to know, for instance, where's the URL endpoint? Is there some authentication? Which HTTP method? Are there special HTTP headers to send? And also, what does that RESTful service provide? Is it JSON response? Is it XML? How is it structured? So there is a lot to know about an external RESTful service before you can start actually consuming it. And to be honest, you can consume external RESTful services even with Apex 5, 5.1, 5.2, 4.0. Yes, you can consume an external RESTful service even with HTMLDB 5.1.5. You don't have much convenience, right? But it's possible. There is clear SQL, the UTL HTTP package was available always. And so, of course, even with the very old Apex version, you can fire up UTL HTTP, execute an HTTP request, get the XML or JSON back, start parsing it, and then provide data for your report. But it's a lot of coding, and it's a lot of doing low-level work. And the goal for Apex 18 is to take away all that low-level work from you, developers, so that you can focus on the business logic and all about HTTP requests, all about JSON parsing is done by Apex. So let's try to create a web source module right now. But before doing this, I would like to highlight a few examples which are available on the community already. So I've seen this on Twitter, I've seen this on blog postings, and in the meantime, we have quite a few examples of folks already playing with web source modules, already doing work with web source modules, and tweeting and blogging about this. And one example is here, that's actually from me. And on the Apex Oracle Application Express blog a few weeks ago, I blogged how to access the Twitter API using web source modules, as you will see today. So today you will learn the fundamentals, and using those blog postings, you can dive further into that topic to see, okay, I've seen that demonstration. Now let's start accessing Twitter. And that's a very nice example I got from Daniel Eckberg from Sweden. We had a talk during an Apex Day in Stockholm 2 weeks ago, and then he was telling me that he used web source modules to access the Clash Royale API. So typically, I first heard about Clash Royale from my 13-year-old son some months ago. Until that, I never knew that this even existed. And I wasn't actually aware that there is an API. And here's what you can do. If you're a gamer, you can even access those gaming APIs with Application Express, create interactive reports or other components based on top of that API. Another example that was on Twitter also recently is a Brazilian zip code API, but I'm pretty sure there are zip code APIs available for almost every country. And Lucas Rayner blogged about how to use web source modules and pure SQL and the Apex Access package, we will hear about that later, to access the data and even to integrate it in a form. So this blog posting even takes the next step. And the last one, that's from Joel in the last Oracle magazine, and Joel accessed the iTunes API using web source modules. So, and I think those 4 examples show really nice what's possible with Apex 18. It's really possible to integrate all sorts of data sources, and we are really able with Apex to step out of our Oracle database and to really combine external data with our local table data. But now let's see how this is actually done, and let's start creating a first web source module. And of course, I will also use an external API, and that's an API with, where Shakib and I worked with some weeks ago. And it's a movie database. It's not the well-known internet movie database. It's the MovieDB, so it's an alternative, right? And there is a web page, of course. And there is also an API for the Internet Movie Database. And like all REST APIs, typically you invoke it with HTTP requests, of course. And there is typically a URL endpoint. There are some parameters. Some REST APIs require HTTP headers to be set. Other REST APIs require specific HTTP methods to be used. This is a rather simple one. The only thing is you need an API key if you want to play with this, but you get this for free. And the request which has to be done is actually pretty simple. You can even play with a browser. So it's search movie, then we have to provide the API key, and we can now search for movies. Let's search for Kill Bill. And then we get movie information where Kill Bill is some part of the title or the description. So let's take that information to actually integrate that into our Apex application. So let's go. When you have an Apex application in Apex 18, and typically you start here in Application Builder, so you navigate into your application, shared components, and the first thing you have to do is when you are inside a firewall, as I am today, you first make sure that you set the proxy server. In my case, it's already set. So fine, Apex can access the internet. If you are outside of a firewall, of course, you don't have to do it. But when you're inside, set the proxy server according to your needs, right? Then navigate to web source modules. And it's always in shared components in the lower left corner of the screen. And of course, at the beginning, this is all empty. And we will start by creating a web source module from scratch. We don't have an existing one. So we have now to pick a web source type. And here Apex provides simple HTTP, Oracle REST Data Services, and Oracle Cloud Applications. So choose Oracle REST Data Services or Oracle Cloud Applications only when you're sure that your REST API is driven by ORDS, by Oracle REST Data Services or
Carsten?
Oracle Cloud Applications. Yes?
Carsten, can I just interrupt you there for a minute? Can you make your screen bigger because it's a bit hard to read?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. So the bigger screen. So where was I? When you are unsure about what technology your REST API actually use simple HTTP. We could also name it generic, right? So that's just use generic methods to access that RESTful service. So now we need the API endpoint, and we need to provide a name. And I will call it movies. So first, Apex checks whether this server API, the MovieDB, really exists. So if you have firewall problems or whatever, you would notice right now That screen shows you Apex can reach out to the internet and actually access that server. It doesn't mean that that the API works. You will see that later on. But this means the physical connection does work. Okay. Apex allows you now to store the server part, so the first part of the URL, as a separate entity. And that's very important if you are about to work with test development and production environments. So from a development Apex environment, you might want to talk to a development RESTful service. And once that application is moved to test and production, you want to move the REST API also to test and to production. And now let's imagine we have 20, 30, 50 web source modules created, and we had to replace the server part for all of these web source modules. That would be quite a pile of work, but it isn't necessary because that is stored as a separate entity, the remote server, and we will have to change that only in one place, the remote server. Typically, you can just say next, right? So then it says, oh, you need authentication. And for authentication, we can choose between basic authentication and OAuth2 client credentials flow. So actually, the MovieDB is neither of these. So because we are authenticated with an API key. So API key is not offered here, but no problem. Just click on Advanced. And this allows you to configure parameters. And we will configure a query string parameter named API key. And we will use that to provide the API key. And we will provide another query string, that's the query, and we will initialize this with Star Trek. We have to provide at least some value because the next step, Apex will discover that RESTful service. And the API key is something which is really static, right? You don't want to change that for each and every component. So we will declare this one as static. Once we have done everything, we hit discover. And we will see. So the report is a bit sparse. That's because of those long descriptions here. But we can see that Apex seems to be able to parse that the response from that RESTful service. We can also have a look into the data profile, and we see there are column names, there are data types. So Apex was able to turn that JSON structure, which was received from the RESTful service, into a table model, so to say. Apex now knows which attributes are returned from the RESTful service, and Apex also knows how to provide a table view on top of those attributes. We can hit create web source. And now we have created metadata for our RESTful endpoint in Application Express. If you click the name, you get into the edit section, and here you can maintain and change every single detail of your web source module. So you might want to add additional parameters. Maybe in the future that API requires a special HTTP header always to be sent. You would just add it here, right? You can always review the data profile, and these are the columns which are returned from the RESTful service. Sometimes Apex doesn't get the columns right. You will see that the data type is not appropriate, right? Why isn't the date? It's clearly a date. So Apex didn't recognize it as a date. So you can always hit edit and change all details of a column. And you can even add new columns if the JSON changes, or you can remove columns if you don't need them. Every little detail can be changed here. In most cases, you don't need to do anything. You can just use the service as Apex created it. So we have created a web source module, but page-wise on our application pages, nothing happened so far, right? It's just metadata as a shared component in Application Express. So now let's create a report on top of that RESTful API. And I will use the create page wizard to create a report, and I will use a classic report. So, and this will be the movie search. We will turn this into a search page. Let's also have a navigation menu entry. And here is also the place where the create page wizard really changed in Apex 18. we again have a select list to pick a data source, and we will use web source. And let's pick our movies web source. We don't really need all of these columns, right? It's all a bit much, and if we pick them all, it would just look bad. So let's just pick a few columns. We don't even need the ID column right now. Let's put the title in front. The poster path is also okay. Vote count and vote average. That doesn't look too bad. And now let's create the region, and we could also change the initial query here. For now, we will keep that with Star Trek, but we will make this interactive. You will see. So now the report region has been created. We have our 5 columns, and we could even provide a nice title. Movies report 1 isn't so nice. And let's run that page. And here we are. So that's our first result, a classic report reporting on data from an external RESTful service, right? And there is no table. So that's an application, an Apex application without any table. All data comes from the internet. And how much time did we use for this? It was about 10 minutes to provide the metadata and to provide the first result on the screen. But we are not finished so far. We want to make this interactive, right? Otherwise, it's boring. So let's now add some search capability. And it's really simple. Just think about the Apex way of doing things, right? So first, I want to have a static content region. That's search field. And I want to have an item to type the query. Next, I want to have the report, which works with the web source module, to pick up the item. And that's what the parameters node is for. So we have declared parameters in our web source module. And so we have parameters here. And you see there is only the query parameter. The API key is missing. That's because we defined the API key as static. And that makes sense, right? We don't want to use another API key here. Here, we just want to provide a different query. And now we change that from static value to item, and we pick that item. This is now the same as if we used :p2 search in a SQL query. And whenever we have a component which is dependent on a page item, never forget to add this to page items to submit. So let's say that. Then one last thing, when nothing is typed into the search field, we don't want to show anything, right? There is no sense in showing an empty region. So let's add a server-side condition, and let's show the report only when the search item is not null. And if I did nothing wrong, we should now have a search field. Let's now search for Star Trek again. And we will see, you see something is, but let's first check whether the functionality is working. Okay, let's search, for instance, for Pulp Fiction. So actually, the interactivity in the searching works so far. That's really nice. And again, how much time did this consume just to provide, to make this functionality interactive? As soon as we have everything encapsulated as a web source module, it becomes as easy to work with that web source module as with a table, right? We don't have to bother about how to pass that parameter to the RESTful service anymore. It's all stored in the Apex metadata, and we are now just doing it the Apex way. We are working with components, and we are connecting the components together. So let's now do a tiny bit of UI polishing. So first, we want to have that below the search region, and I also would like to do something with the poster path. And that's actually, when you look at the poster path, there is some file name or whatever this is. And once you look a bit into the MovieDB API documentation, you will see that that you can provide that this is part of a URL. So you just have to provide the right URL prefix. So actually, I should have written that down. Let me just look this up. No, I didn't. So let's do it though. The movie poster path. I should have written that down, but Google has an answer to everything, and we should find that out pretty quickly. Otherwise, and here we are. So we have to provide that poster path. And now I will use the standard Apex way. I will use the HTML expression to make an image tag out of it. And then we will replace the dynamic. We will just use as with a normal report on a table, we will just use poster path. And let's pick a bit smaller images. So I want to have images with a width of 200. So let's take that and look into it again. And now we have a report together with posters, and it's still not below. Start new row, yes. So now it's as it should be, right? We have a simple text field with a search functionality. We have a web source module and a report on top of that web source module, and we are now able to search on the Internet Movie Database using the REST API and Application Express. All done within 17 minutes, right? And that's actually the goal of the implementation of web source modules with Application Express. So let's get back to the slides then. So you have seen how we created that web source module metadata, and we have also seen how we have used that web source metadata in a report, and how we connected it to a page item, and how to configure the report to use the page item. We can do pretty much the same for chart regions, for calendar regions, for interactive report regions, and many more things, right? For chart regions, of course, your REST API should provide data in a nice form. But what if the data is in a form which you don't really like to display, right? Let's go back to that API here, and let's now just play a bit with the data. Let's assume we want to derive something from that vote count here. Right, so you have 6 votes on 50 years of Star Trek. We have only 1 vote on building Star Trek. We have 5,000 votes on Star Trek. So there's really a difference here. So actually, what we want to do is not to provide the raw number. We want to provide a classification, and that's what I would like to show you now. So we want to have the report display something which is not provided by the REST API as such. And that's where the fact that Apex runs in a database, that fact comes in very handy now. So in our report region, we have here our web source, and we have the web source module, and there is this local post-processing section here. And once we pick SQL query for that, we will get a query pre-populated. And that actually treats the result of the web source module as it was a table. And we now have a query based on that table. So, and we have the vote count, for instance. And what we now can do is start adding stuff, right? We can say when vote count less than 100, then this is almost no votes, right? when vote count between and then it's quite some votes. And this is so many votes, and this is vote count category. So we can validate this as well. Then here is a syntax error. Another syntax error. And now it validates fine. It also now brought back all the other columns in because we have played with that SQL query. So let's now bring that vote count category over here and hide those columns again. And let's see how this now looks like. And you see we now have a vote count category which is based on the actual vote count. You could now hide that vote count number and just show the category, but you can see Apex allows you to really use the database and SQL and all the SQL functions to refine that data for actual report display. Now I think it's pretty straightforward. We could map that to font Apex icons, right? And based on the data in your from the RESTful service, we use case expressions to map that to an icon name and display nice icons in that report. You can drive that further and further to use that to refine your report layout. Okay, so far on web source modules. We have seen those examples. Let's now talk a bit about REST Enabled SQL, because that's the other data source, the other external data source which has been added in Apex 18.1. And REST Enabled SQL is actually a feature of Oracle REST Data Services. So it's to use REST Enabled SQL, you not only need Apex 18, you also need a current version of Oracle REST Data Services. Because Oracle REST Data Services provides, when REST Enabled SQL is enabled, then ORDS provides a very special REST endpoint, and that REST endpoint allows to execute any SQL query, any pure SQL block. And that's the reason why it has to be enabled beforehand. If you just install ORDS and fire it up, it will be disabled. REST Enabled SQL won't work. You have to go to the ORDS configuration files, enable REST Enabled SQL. This is all outlined in the documentation. And then you have to REST enable your schema for ORDS. And then you can start using REST Enabled SQL. I have prepared that already. And I have one REST Enabled SQL instance up and running. And let me first show you a bit of basic things on REST Enabled SQL. REST Enabled SQL, and I will need to use curl for this. So, and now let's try to invoke REST Enabled SQL first with curl. And that allows you to really see some basics on REST Enabled SQL. Okay, so this is curl. And we will need to provide, we will have to use a post request. We can provide any SQL query we want, right? And this is sent as the request body. So this is the SQL text we are actually sending to the REST Enabled SQL service. Then we need to tell ORDS that this is encoded as JSON. And finally, we need to provide the authentication. Here comes my super secret credential. And then it's just the URL. And here comes, and that /_/SQL references the special REST endpoint, which is actually able to execute any SQL or pure SQL statement. Oh, this doesn't work in C++ for sure. And actually, this should have returned some JSON data, returning some JSON data describing or some JSON data with the results of that query. I won't debug this here anymore. Let's now use Apex for this. So actually, this is the way how it works. So you can send a REST request to that REST enabled SQL service. As part of that REST request, you can provide any SQL query, any DML statement, any pure SQL block, or it will execute that SQL statement and provide results back. So now let's use that in Apex. And we will go to shared components. And above web source modules, there is REST enabled SQL. And here we can create a REST enabled SQL service. And let's provide a name. And let's now use the URL. And here we have to provide authentication as well. We will use basic authentication. And then we create a RESTful service. And when everything was correct, you will see a message like that. So that shows us that Apex was able to connect to that RESTful service, that authentication is correct, the URL was correct, everything is fine, right? We can execute REST-enabled SQL requests to that external instance. Okay, again, we have created metadata for an external service in Application Express. Let's go back to our application. And let's again use Create Page Wizard to create a page. And let's now create an interactive report. And that's on remote database. Again, we want to have a navigation menu entry. And again, we can pick a data source. We will use REST-enabled SQL for now. We will choose the REST-enabled SQL we just have created. And now it fetches the list of available schemas. And you can see we can access objects in the current schema, which is Scott, and also in the HR schema. We can pick a table name. Let's use the employees table. That now fetches the available columns. And this is all on a remote table. And that is a service which is not a local Apex database. It's a REST-enabled, a remote SQL service. And again, we can create our interactive report. Let's now run that report. And we should see an interactive report on the employees table, which we can also query, of course. But again, it's not SQL being executed locally. It's from a remote database. So 2 examples how to use external data sources in Apex components. You can use external Oracle databases with REST-enabled SQL. And in that case, you can use all the SQL features you are used to. You can use all these SQL features also for the remote database. You can play with analytic functions. You can do whatever you want, right? Or you can do web source modules for generic RESTful endpoints. Before going to the Q&A, I would show you one last thing. So let's go back to the slides. We have seen that. And here is actually the curl request. I must have done something wrong beforehand, but that's actually how it works. If you have REST-enabled SQL enabled, you can offer a curl request like this, and you will get a JSON encoded response for your SQL back. Or use Application Express, which does everything out of the box. And that's what we have seen. And the last thing I would like to show you is the Apex Exec package. And so Apex Exec is a new pure SQL package in Apex 18. And this provides programmatic pure SQL access to web source modules or REST Enabled SQL. So what can you use this for? It allows, so what you have seen, how I created an Apex report to work on a web source module. But this was Apex, right? It was an Apex page, it was an Apex report. Apex did everything to visualize the data. What if you wanted to access the RESTful service, query the data, and insert into your own table? Or process somehow, right? I want to grab all the movies every night with the vote counts into my own table, right? That's something which Apex Exec can do for you. And again, it can do these things for you without requiring you to bother on HTTP requests or JSON parsing, because the Apex Exec package makes use of all the stored metadata in Apex. And I have an example for you. All right, so let's go to Apex again. And let's review our metadata for the web source module again. So this is our movies module. And an important thing here is the static ID. So this is also called movies. We won't change it. I just want to review it. Because the static ID, we need that to identify the web source module from pure SQL. So that's fine. Let's now have a look into the pure SQL code for Apex Exec. We don't want to step into that code step by step and everything. Just a few things, right? This actually implements a table function, right? A pipeline table function. You can see the function is named movies. It allows to accepts a query as the p title parameter, and then it works with the Apex Exec package all over the place, right? You see Apex Exec everywhere, and actually this table function does the same as the report before, but it provides the results of the RESTful service as a table function, and I think everybody sees what that means, right? It allows us to process the data however you want. And you will see no JSON or HTTP call here. It's just Apex Exec. So Apex will do all the low-level work. We will just make sure that movies is used as the module static ID. And once we have that, we can start trying things out. Let's go back to SQL+. Log into the database. And run that code. So it will first create the table function, and then it will execute two queries, one without a parameter. So then the default Star Trek will apply, and then it will search for Kill Bill. Let's see what happens. You see two different queries from the MovieDB. Let's also try the Pulp Fiction example. And we can, that's interesting. Tiny bug fixes on the fly. And once we made the varchars large enough, also Pulp Fiction will work. I hope you see what's possible with these new Apex capabilities, right? Without doing too much of a coding, we now, with just having metadata for that one REST API, we can create Apex components on top of it. We can make the Apex components interactive. We can work with pure SQL on top of this. We can even provide table functions. We could now start working with scheduler jobs and start utilizing all the database features to integrate that REST API into our database application. And all the low-level work, all the understanding for the technical details of the REST API is up to Apex. You can work on a higher level just with a data source and some columns, right? On the Oracle Application Express blog, blogs.oracle.com/apex, you will find more examples about how to use web source modules with PL SQL. There was one blog posting saying web source modules and PL SQL, providing more examples. And the Apex exec package is of course documented in the API reference as well. Okay, so the second use case for Apex exec is plugin development. And like Apex components, your plugins can be data source aware as well, right? So when creating a plugin in Apex 18, there will be a plugin attribute which says supports multiple data sources. And once you enable that and your PL SQL code makes usage of Apex exec, your plugin can consume local data sources, remote data sources, or web source modules, right? And your plugin will look exactly like an Apex component in Page Designer. As you can see on the screenshot here, right? This is a plugin. And as for the classic report, we have the location, we have the module, so it looks the same. And the plugin will work and will display data either from the remote, local, or web source module, right? We also have a blog posting on this, more details, and an example how to build a plugin is available on that blog posting. So you will learn how to build a label cloud plugin, which is data source aware, just by following that blog posting. Let's summarize that. Apex 18 introduces for the first time the ability to have an Apex component on top of external data, right? An external data source becomes as easy to use as a table, right? A REST API with a web source module and the data profile is presented to you developers as it was a table. And you can build Apex components on top of that REST endpoint as on top of a table. You can use the Apex exec package to programmatically work on that REST endpoint as you would query a table, right? And all HTTP communication, all the low-level stuff is done by Apex. You don't have to bother about this. And once things change, once the API changes, the endpoint changes, you just have to change to adjust the metadata. And once your web source module is adjusted to work with the REST and with the changed REST endpoint again, all referencing components will immediately work again, right? Think about doing everything manually and a REST endpoint changing. It's myriads of lines of PL SQL code to change. Here, everything is part of the Apex metadata. We can fully leverage that metadata to really encapsulate that REST API endpoint, those REST endpoint details into an Apex entity, so to say. As said in the beginning, available for read-write for read-only in Apex 1 and Apex 18.1 today, right? That's here. And we are currently working on support for read-write components. So that the goal is to enable you to create a form on a RESTful service, interactive grid on a RESTful service as today for an interactive report. We are working on this. This is planned for post 18.2, not 19 something. We will see when we have that available. That's all I have so far. Thanks very much for your attention. And let's now move on to the Q&A.
Okay, Carsten. So I have a number of questions here for you. The first one I have is you showed briefly about entering in the proxy when you were doing the before you entered in the web source module. What other security is required? For example, what if I wanted to use HTTPS and that sort of thing?
So actually, HTTPS is the most interesting and for many people, for sure, the most important question. So many APIs are secured by HTTPS. So the database, so all the Apex infrastructure for RESTful service and for web source modules relies on a database package. So Apex runs in the Oracle database, so we use the database infrastructure, of course. And the infrastructure, most of you know it, for doing REST interaction is UTL HTTP, the basic package for HTTP requests in the Oracle database. That package can do HTTPS, so can Apex. It's for most REST APIs, it's required to provide a wallet to the database. And it's another topic which is way too large to be discussed in as part of this session. So I would like to just to highlight one blog posting on the Application Express post. You need to scroll down a little bit because it has been a while since that was published. So the typical situation you will encounter when trying to access an HTTPS REST service is something like that. And whenever you see error messages like that, you try to work with a web source module and Apex just responds with that certificate validation failure. Look up that blog posting, read it. Here is the full article. You have to click once more. Read it and follow all these instructions. And that are the instructions how to enable your database to talk to that to an HTTPS protected REST endpoint. That's part of the database infrastructure. It's like UTL HTTP always worked together with HTTPS, and so it always required the database wallet to be configured, some certificates to be imported into that wallet, and since we leverage on, since we rely on that infrastructure, the same is to be done for Apex.
Okay, great. So my next question comes from Kevin, and he's interested in how do you actually, is there information that you can track on how many times a particular web service was called and that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's actually available, and that's one of the features in 18.1, which is also new, by the way, right? But that's one of these minor features. You know, every Apex release, not only Apex, also the database, every product has those features, those releases. There are some major features everybody talks about, then there are the minor features nobody talks about, right? And web service logging is one of those minor features. So beginning with Apex 18, Apex logs each web service request automatically. Whenever you use web source modules, whenever you have pure SQL code running using Apex Web Service, this is logged by Apex, right? And there is a dictionary view for that. And let's try to query that from Apex Web Service log. And here you go. That's the answer to your question. So you see, in that office hours section, I have created that schema anew before the office hours session. And you can see we executed 32 web service requests in the last session. Apex records everything for us.
Great. So my next question is, how do you handle if there's large data volumes in the web service?
So that's an interesting question. It's a good question. The question is,
I know it's a good question. That's why I asked it.
That's the question is, what exactly is a bandwidth? How do you deal with large data, right? So actually, so there's one implication of large data. Once we repeatedly invoke an external RESTful service, and let's assume that RESTful service always returns 3 megabytes of data, right? Because that REST API just provides a larger chunk. Then with each invocation, we would download 3 megabytes of data. And that's something where the REST web source module caching feature comes in. I have to talk about this, but you will find that in the web source modules metadata again. And we have our generic web source metadata here. Then we have operations. This module has just one operation. That's the get, which we configured. Once we go into the details of that, we have a caching part. So, and we can cache for all users. And then the question is, let's cache that for 30 minutes, right? That cache is, of course, parameter aware. So when I now execute a query Star Trek, it will get the data from the external REST API and cache it for 30 minutes. When within the next 30 minutes, the Star Trek query is done again, the result will be taken from the cache and no HTTP request or REST invocation will be made. So that's one way of dealing with large amounts of data. Large amounts of data can have other multiple implications, but I don't want to extend the scope of that question.
No, that's a great response. Thank you for showing us the caching capability. So one of the questions on REST Enabled SQL, when you pulled up the other schema, you saw all the tables. What about if you only wanted to have access to a few of the tables? Can you do that, or do you have to have it available to all tables in the schema?
No, typically, actually, I even did it wrong, right? What did I do? I REST enabled the Scott schema and connected to that Scott schema. And that means I have access to all the tables in the Scott schema. And how did that HR table came in? So that was actually a grant. So the HR.employees table, select on the employees table in HR was granted to Scott. But actually, since the Scott schema owns objects, that was actually even wrong. Even my demo was wrong. I have to admit it, right? What's the right way of doing it? The right way is, and that's not new for REST Enabled SQL or for Apex, actually that's 20-year-old knowledge how to design an application in the Oracle database. What have we learned? We have one schema which owns the objects, and I remember that even from my lessons at university. The professor said, you have that schema which owns the objects, and once you're done with developing, that schema is being locked, right? And then you have a second schema, right? And all the necessary grants on views and SQL packages are granted to that connection schema. And the application uses the connection schema to connect to the database, and it has access to all objects which grants have been issued for. And that's the same you should do for REST-enabled SQL. So when you are thinking about using REST-enabled SQL to access an external database, don't REST-enable SQL the owner of the objects. Create a second schema. Let's call it REST Connect or whatever, right? And then those objects which require to be accessed from remotely, grant select privileges and only those privileges you really need. If it's read only, just grant select, or even better, grant only the read privilege. There is a read privilege which doesn't allow to log rows, by the way. Grant just the read privilege to that REST SQL user, and then in REST Enabled SQL in Apex, when we use the select list to see the list of tables, we would see just those tables we have privileges to, and then we can on a very fine level we can control which objects to access and which not.
Great, thank you very much. We're almost out of time, but another couple of quick questions. Regarding REST-enabled SQL, can they be utilized with non-Oracle databases?
Not now. So actually, it's the question, which databases does ORTS support, and for which databases ORTS can provide that REST-enabled SQL endpoint. And as of today, with ORTS 18.2, which is out now, ORTS supports only the Oracle database for this. This possibly might be extended in the future, but I'm not aware of any immediate plans.
Okay, thank you. And have a question here on using REST with SAS. So can you use REST with SAS? Are there people that are actually doing it?
So REST with SAS, I'm pretty sure there are people already which massively using REST with SAS, because REST is so to say, the default way of integrating with SAS, with SAS cloud services. However, when we narrow the question to is somebody using web source modules in Apex with SAS, then I'm not aware of customers doing this right now. I'm pretty sure.
If you actually do a look at some of the work that JMJ Cloud have been doing, they've been doing just that. So I'll help you answer that question.
That's great. So I learned something new again as well. That's the good thing about these sessions, right? Everybody learns. So I think we will see web source modules being more and more adopted for that kind of things. I'm pretty sure when it's about using Apex Web Service package and SQL coding, I'm pretty sure a massive amount of customers is doing that today, right? And that's just another level of accessing SaaS services.
Great. So my last question, again was related to REST Enabled SQL, and can you utilize SSO with that? I was a bit unsure with that one. I thought I'd ask you.
Actually, not now. Why? When REST Enabled, I don't think that. I think that goes into the wrong direction. Actually, when we are talking about REST Enabled SQL, we are talking about machine-to-machine communication. So it's not about the end user logging into using SSO to log in and then typing a SQL query and executing it on a database. We are talking about an application using REST-enabled SQL. So the application provides something to the end user, and the application uses REST-enabled SQL to talk to the remote database. So the machine has to talk to the remote database, not the end user. And the machine, of course, doesn't have an SSO account. However, I can see where this is heading to. You have seen me using database username and password to authenticate. And of course, that's something which you sometimes just don't want to do. And there is an alternative for this. You can use OAuth to authenticate for REST-enabled SQL. And then you would use a client ID and a client secret instead of username and password. And the advantage of client ID and client secret is that these are typically throwaway credentials. And every client gets their own OAuth credential. You can generate them as you want, and they are not as sensitive and, so to say, important as a database user, right? If some credential with OAuth gets compromised, you just revoke it, and then that client cannot connect anymore. And they get another one, right? It's a totally different story than locking a database account, potentially locking out 100 applications, right? So the recommended way is actually using OAuth, and that's even outlined in the assistant. So when I created that REST, let me just quickly do the steps again, and we will see that. When I created the web source module, there was authentication type basic or OAuth. OAuth is the default, and when we pick basic, Apex even says out, hey, have a look at OAuth, this is better, right? For demo purposes, I use basic, and that's always the quickest one. But OAuth is also always an alternative, and for a production setup, I would really recommend to look into OAuth. It requires a few more steps on the auth side, but actually it's worth it.
Great, thank you very much for that, Carsten. We've run out of time. In fact, we're a bit over time, but thank you very much for a great session. Thank you everyone for attending. And at this point in time, if you have any further questions, you can actually go and ask them on the office hours. There'll be another session coming up in 2 weeks' time, so we hope to see you back then. And for now, have a great rest of your day and enjoy playing with Apex and with all the great stuff that Carsten's just been showing.